What is going on, everybody? This challenge tutorial is about perpetual checks. If you haven't checked out the other challenge tutorials, there will be a link in the description to a playlist which contains them all, ranging from smother mates to sacrifices to brilliant moves and more. Let's go ahead and fire this up with problem number 1 right away, and it is white to move. Each puzzle we will give you a 3-second countdown to go ahead and pause the video so you can take as much time as needed, and then unpause when you're ready to continue. We'll do that now. 1, 2, and 3. White's move is rook to h7. Black's only reply is sidestepping to g8. We're going to go ahead and give you 3 more seconds to pause the video to figure out the continuation from here. 1, 2, and 3. The continuation should be rook to g7 check, and then the king would have to sidestep back to the original position on h8. The perpetual checks will continue with the rook going back and forth between g7 and h7, and the king going back and forth between h8 and g8. This next position, it is white to move and not lose. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The only move that doesn't lose is rook capture b7 check. The king's going to go to a8. It won't go to c8 because the threat of the g7 rook going to c7 with checkmate. So after the king goes to the corner, it's your move. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. It is rook capture a7 check, and the king is kicked back to the b8 square. Give you 3 more seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, 3. The proper move is the a7 rook moving to b7, because the king, as we said, is not going to go to c8 because rook on the g7 will go to c7 checkmate. So the king will go back to the corner, and the threat will be king back and forth between b8 and a8, and the rook between a7 and b7. The reason why we don't want to bring the rook from g7 over to b7, even though it will work for a 3-fold repetition, it's just starting fresh, and we have to do 3 moves more than the other way because we don't have any previous iterations of this position. Here on this next position, it is white to move, and we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video as normal. 1, 2, and 3. The only move which doesn't lose the game is queen to d8 check, and black only has 1 move, and that's bringing the king to a7. The continuation, we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video to figure it out. 1, 2, and 3. Queen to a5 is the only move which doesn't lose the game as normal, and the perpetual checks will go back and forth between queen to a5 and queen d8, and the king will juggle between a7 and b8. On this next one, it is white to move as usual. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need. 1, 2, and 3. The first move is queen to h6 check. Black's only legal move is bringing the king over to g8. And for the continuation, we'll give you 3 more seconds to pause the video again. 1, 2, and 3. The move is queen captures a g6 check. Black's only legal move is back to the corner on h8. The continuation of perpetual motion is going to be queen back and forth between g6 and h6, and the king between g8 and h8. This next position, it is white to move. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need a little bit more time. 1, 2, and 3. The only move that doesn't lose is knight to g6 check. King has to come up to h7, and it is your turn again as white. We'll give you 3 more seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The only move that doesn't lose is knight to f8 check, and the perpetual check will be the knight back and forth between g6 and f8, and the king between h7 and h8. This next problem, it is white to move, and we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video to allow yourself more time to figure this one out. 1, 2, and 3. Well, the proper answer is pawn to D7 first. That puts a discovery check on the king, and he has nothing to block, so the king must go to A7 first. The reason why capturing the pawn doesn't work is because the pawn is crucial to cutting the king off to C8. Otherwise, the perpetual check is not possible. So once the king boogies to A7, it is white's turn, and we'll give you 3 more seconds to go ahead and pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. And the proper answer is bishop to D4 check. Has nothing to block, so the king's got to return to B8. And the perpetual is going to be the bishop bouncing back and forth between E5 and D4, and the king between B8 and A7. It is white to move. We will give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Very counterintuitive, but the only move that keeps the game from losing for white is rook to G7 check. The bishop is unable to capture the rook because the game would end immediately. White has no legal moves, and it would be a stalemate. So black is forced to push the king in the corner with king H8. For the continuation, we'll give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. The move is rook to G8 check, and then that sends the king right back to H7. The perpetual motion for white is going to be the rook back and forth between G7 and G8, and the black king between H7 and H8. In this position, it is white to move. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video to allow yourself as much time as needed to figure this out. 1, 2, and 3. The only move which doesn't lose is queen captures bishop on F8 check. And black's move is forced with rook to G8 blocking the check. The continuation will give you 3 more seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The only move which doesn't lose from here is queen to F6 check. And black has the option to either block with the rook on H7 by putting it on G7, or the rook on G8 by putting it on G7. We'll do the G8, G7 example first. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. You guys got it. It is queen to F8 check. And that would be the perpetual check, the queen back and forth between F6 and F8, and the rook between G7 and G8. But if they choose to block with the rook over on H7 to G7, the correct response would be queen to H6 check. And then you juggle back and forth between queen H6 and queen F6, and the rook between G7 and H7. Or a combination in the two. It is quite possible that they switch up from blocking with one rook to the next, and then you basically would have to do more than 3 moves to get the draw rule initiated. It would be more like 5. In this position, it is white to move, and we will give you 3 seconds to go ahead and pause the video so you can take your time and figure everything out you have to on your own time. 1, 2, and 3. The only move which doesn't lose for white is a rook to G7 check, forcing the black king to H8. For the continuation, we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video again. 1, 2, and 3. The key here is to prevent the king from getting to the H7 square. And the only move that does that and puts the king in check is a rook to F7 check with a discovery with the dark squared bishop over on B2. The king now is forced to go back to G8. If you had retreated the rook anywhere along the G file, the king would be able to go to H7, and it would not turn out good for white in the long run. With that being said, after the rook goes over to F7, capturing the pawn, and the king returns to G8, the perpetual is going to be the rook going back and forth between G7 and F7, and the king going between H8 and G8. This last position, you're on the defense. The black queen goes to b6 with check, and we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need more time. 1, 2, and 3. The proper move is king to a8, not c8. Once you do that, the queen will go to a6, checking you again. You only have one legal move. That's going back to b8, and the queen will follow on b6, putting you in the same position. The rinse repeat will be king going back and forth between a8 and b8, and the queen is going to go back and forth between a6 and b6. The reason why c8 does not work for an escape is because the black king will approach on c5. You have two moves. If you go to d7, then the queen will come over to d6. You have two squares to move to. One of them loses the pawn, and if you go behind the pawn on c8, then the king will push itself to c6, one step closer. You have one legal move, which is b8. The queen will capture your pawn. One legal move, a8, and then queen on b7 is checkmate. If you take the other square, instead of d7 going to d8, then the king just approaches, your pawn is pinned, and you have three moves. Two of them loses the pawn immediately, and the only one that keeps the pawn is directly associated with a checkmate. That's going to go ahead and wrap things up. That's going to go ahead and wrap things up. That's going to go ahead and wrap things up for this tutorial. And I'm going to be trying new videos. I'm still trying to hone in and see which videos you guys like the best. Because I noticed that the people that watch my videos don't comment. You know, even the videos that have hundreds of views, no comments. So I'm kind of figuring this all out on my own. But I appreciate you guys, and I hope that you do enjoy these little challenge tutorials. I'm going to be doing more of them on the different tactics available. So sit tight, and once again, I do truly appreciate every last one of you. I will see you guys on the next video. Ciao.